Oh, I'm so full of different emotions right now. I'm excited. Today's finally the day. Got to drive down to Vancouver, and Pastor Bill Ritchie offered to give away his library of books. And so I'm headed down there to acquire some books. And that's really exciting. And shout out to Pastor Bill and Daniel Fusco of Crossroads Community Church in Vancouver. Cool brothers in the Lord. And on the flip side, our dog has been really sick, and she's not that old. She's only 10 years old, but she's just like, on her last leg, and she hadn't been eating and kind of thinking she was just giving up, but she would eat people food. So I told Nicole, well, let's give it one last shot. Let's just give the dog people food. And so, of course, I am now, as I'm trying to get into this Bible study, I see my baby Ellie is there by the dog food, eating pasta that was leftover pasta we gave the dog, and she's sitting there feeding her. She's got pasta on her face. She's eating out of the dog bowl that's been sitting there for over a day. Okay. Anyway, parenting's fun. Some of you guys watching don't know what it's like raising a ton of kids, right, Yesenia? Anyway, all right, we're in Leviticus chapter 3, and this is now the peace offering or the fellowship offering. And so let's see here. Interesting. I have a note here. It says the fat and the blood to God. We haven't gotten that part yet, but let's move ahead and we'll kind of see where this goes. When his offering is a sacrifice of a peace offering. So these are all different sacrifices. And again, review today. Chapter 1, the burnt offering, the total consecration offering. The whole offering goes to God. Offering number 2 in chapter 2 is the grain offering or service offering, where it represents our service to the Lord and how our service, right? It's finely ground flour, it's hard work, and we're doing it for the Lord. And it has incense, frankincense, and oil with it, which oil being symbolic of the Holy Spirit, incense being symbolic of prayer. So here we have our prayerful, spirit-filled efforts being offered up to the Lord. And as with most of the offerings, in that one, the priests got some of the grain. They got to eat it. That was their income. The first one is a total consecration to God. The whole thing burns. It's the only one that the whole thing is burnt up. This third one now, though, is a peace offering or a fellowship offering. So if he offers it of the herd, now this could be the same thing in verse 6 if it's of the flock, verse 12 if it is a goat. So it's a little bit repetitive, and I'm not going to redo it all, but it's just same situation, but here if it's this animal, you do it this way. If it's this animal, you do it that way. And so if he's of the herd, whether a male or a female, it doesn't matter. So again, all the offerings were different. He shall offer it without blemish before the Lord. He shall lay its hand on the head of the offering, kill it at the door of the tabernacle meeting, and Aaron and his sons, the priest, shall sprinkle the blood on the altar. The blood belongs to the Lord. Then he shall offer the sacrifice of the peace offering, an offering made by fire to the Lord, all the fat that covers the entrails, and all the fat that is on the entrails, the 2 kidneys, and the fat that is on them by the flanks, above the fatty lobe, attached to the liver, above the kidneys, he shall remove. And Aaron's son shall burn it on the altar upon the burnt sacrifice, which is on the wood, which is on the fire, as an offering made by fire, a sweet aroma to the Lord. I mentioned this in Jeremiah not long ago, if you're going with us through Jeremiah at night, where we dig in deep to all the verses. But kidneys. Here it actually says kidneys because it's talking about body parts. But sometimes even when it talks about like in my heart, to the depths of my heart in the Bible, it's actually kidneys. And Job 19:27 is one reference I wrote down. My heart yearns. It's literally my kidneys yearn. And again, like, well, that sounds weird to us, but again, different culture. Hearts pump blood. You all know that, right? That hearts actually have 0% effect on your feelings. Why is it we talk about the heart being wicked and deceitful and desperately wicked. Well, because we've always understood there's something about deep within here. There's just this feeling in your chest, right? But the kidneys was something that the Jewish people, that was the depths in my kidneys. And so they use kidneys like we use heart often. And so God gets the kidneys of this animal, and God gets the blood and all the fat. Now, the fat really smells good. And so it's this sweet smelling aroma. He gets the heart, this depths of the emotion of the animal. There's certain parts of this offering, but you'll notice people aren't eating the kidneys. You're not eating the fat, just the straight fat. They're not allowed to eat the blood. So all the parts God is taking are the parts that people don't eat. Now, it mentions if it's of the flock. And again, it's the same thing, but it talks about the fat tail in verse 9, right? Everything else is the same. And if it's of a goat, again, it talks about laying his head on the goat and all of that. And all the fat is the Lord. But in verse 17, this is a perpetual statute throughout all your generations and all your dwellings. You shall eat neither fat nor blood. So if you go to chapter 7, we'll get more details about this. Now, as I quickly moved over, I'm taking a second because once I've told you guys before, I don't read ahead when we do these studies. And something I was expecting to see, I'm not finding, and that's not very helpful for me. The peace offering, right? Sacrifices of the peace offering. My Bible has a reference to Leviticus 22. Let me go quickly over to 22 and see if what I'm looking for is there. Is that embarrassing when you expect to find something and you don't find it? Feasts of the Lord, chapter 22. What does it say for verses here? There's a reference in my Bible. I'm hoping it's what I'm looking for. Verse 20. Offerings. Oh, nope. That's just talking about, you can't offer up animals that are, broken and whatnot. So let me talk about the peace offering. And I'm drawing a blank, and maybe one of you guys who has access to their phone could look it up faster than me. But the idea of the peace offering was it was called a fellowship offering. And that's why I was like looking through my notes is like, why don't I have it written down in here somewhere about the idea of this fellowship offering? But the idea was that this offering would be eaten by the people. And again, I'm like embarrassed that I drawing a blank and can't remember where the cross reference is supposed to be. Probably in Numbers. That it has to be done at the tabernacle. You're not allowed to take it away, but you could invite all these people, and you'll notice the only things burnt was the blood. Well, the blood goes on the altar, and the fat, the kidneys, those are burnt for the Lord. The Lord gets that portion, but then the priests and the people get the rest, and they all eat it together. And the idea was gathering together at the tabernacle, God's dwelling place, and fellowshipping with one another and eating. I'm gonna have to find it and post it in the description or the comments because I'm totally irritated now that I didn't have that cross reference where it goes into the details on how this works. But the idea was it has to be at the tabernacle. Now, we are the church, right? We don't have to be at a specific building, but ecclesia. Ek means out, away from, it's a distancing thing, leaving out of a place and going away. The ecclesia, the idea is the assembly. And the idea is going out and assembling together. Now, obviously, if the church meets at your house, you don't have to go out. But the assumption is somebody is leaving their dwelling place to gather together with other believers. And when gathered together, you are the ecclesia. You are the church. We aren't the church when we're by ourselves. We're all part of the body of Christ. We're all members, right? But the church, when you say we are the church, we've got to go out and gather together. We have to be out and part of this. That's why I struggle. with those who might follow online, but have the physical ability to actually go, right? And I'm talking, I mean, it's one thing, to catch an online service here or there in addition to your regular church service, right? But when you only are doing online and you have the ability, right? I feel bad when I say this and someone's like, well, what about my elderly grandma who's bedridden? Of course, I'm not talking about your elderly grandma who's bedridden. But so many people have the ability to go and they just choose not to. And we're missing out on something. Now, tonight, we're having a little meeting at our church. It's just an open meeting for those who are invested in our church and want to be part of the vision and future and direction of our church. We open it up, not just church leadership, but really anyone who wants to be invested. And the idea is that we gather and we eat first. Our church is still small enough, and I hope maybe some way, even if our church got too big, we could still find a way to do like church potluck, church eating times. In the early church, something that I always try and remind people of when we take communion, so much, if not almost everything about the way churches do communion is all tradition. There is very little instruction on how we take communion. And I can't name a single church, just being honest. I can't name a single church that I know that actually takes communion like the early church did. I'm sure there are churches. I don't know of a single one. I couldn't name one. And I know quite a few. The early church in 1 Corinthians, we find them actually struggling because people were getting drunk off the communion and they were getting glutted off the bread. You see, the early church had agape feast. And to me, that's like the New Testament equivalent of the fellowship offering, this peace offering in Leviticus 3, where people brought their sacrifice, this peace offering, and it was intended to be something that brought people together, God's people, and they shared in the meal together. We have potlucks. You bring stuff to the potluck and you all share in it together. And there's something about you bringing your food and they bring their food, contributing as part of the whole experience. And there's fellowship. And in the early church, they called these the agape love feasts. And it was at the conclusion of the agape feast that they would also take communion. What gets lost in American culture and really just 21st century culture is that for the Jewish people in these days, bread and wine was like at every meal. And sometimes that was the meal, right? When you're a humble folk and you don't have a lot of money, you don't have a lot of means, it's not like you're swinging by KFC and picking up your chicken. Bread was dinner. People had bread, and that's all they had to eat. And they had their wine, which was all they would usually have to drink. And so that was at the meal. And so they actually were taking something that was part of a normal daily meal. And it wasn't like they had the special bread and the special wine. I mean, it really was kind of like, and now we're just taking time to remember the Lord and give thanks for his body and his blood while we eat together. I had thrown out in the past. And I don't know, I afraid there'd been a coup and I'd get kicked out or something. It's like, what if on potluck Sunday, we took communion during the potluck? Because that's actually like what the early church used to do. And if you're like me, I can see some of you who are watching, right? Like our churches probably serve communion in a little shot glass, and you get a little pre-made cracker crumble or broken little pieces of cracker, and that's the way we've always taken communion. But back then they had big pieces of bread. People overate the bread. People got drunk on the wine. I mean, and the idea was, though, it was actually a time where they sat down and they ate this meal together and they remembered Jesus. It wasn't just this little boop boop, and they were done. Now, in order to have a church service not take forever, having small elements is practical. Having small elements is cost effective. To avoid gluttony and drunkenness, having small elements definitely makes that happen, right? So it's not wrong either. You don't need an entire glass of juice or whatever, and you don't need, an entire loaf of bread in order to remember the Lord. But it's just good for us to remember that almost all of the reasons we do communion the way we do it, and one church versus another church, it's really just tradition, preference, practicality. It's not so much about biblical. It has to be done this way. We have a few things. 1 Corinthians 11 is really the best place to go. And it's very minimal what was laid out for us. But like the fellowship offering, like the peace offering in Leviticus 3, in case you came in late and wondered, I thought we were in Leviticus, right? People brought the food and then they shared it all together. We as a church, the early church, had the agape feast. People would come together, they'd eat, they'd break bread, and then they'd also take communion. And again, this coming Sunday is potluck Sunday at our church. And that's kind of the idea of the peace offering, that we would bring together and come together and fellowship with one another. This is like biblical. Potluck Sunday is not necessarily even like, it's not something you have to do, right? Churches aren't wrong if they don't do potluck Sunday. It'd be very impractical in a multi-thousand person church, I'm sure, or at least be very hard to manage. Diana would have her work cut out for her. But the idea is that the concept of gathering together to eat together, that is in the Old Testament, that is in the New Testament, and it is something we should continue doing. So, I wonder if I can swipe this. Nope. I can see Robert say, that's why we. I'm sure he said something profound after that, but I have a bubble that popped up. I can't see the rest. So, trust Robert. He's probably saying something correct. All that said, hey guys, Potluck Sunday is this Sunday at our church. We have a church meeting tonight in which we will be eating at as well. Tonight, starting food at 6, meeting at 6:30. So, yeah. Oh. That's why we do a weekly agape meal at Ecclesia. Okay, yeah. At Robert's church, they do a weekly agape meal. So again, it's a biblical thing, guys. So, plan. That's a choice you make. Plan on eating with your church when there's opportunities to. It's biblical. It's like this peace offering. All right? Hey, God bless you guys. Like I mentioned, I'm going to go find that cross-reference that I was embarrassed I couldn't find, and for whatever reason I don't have written in my Bible. Somewhere it goes and it explains in detail the idea of like people weren't supposed to take the food home. They were actually supposed to eat it at the tabernacle, and that was a big deal. So like that's kind of the idea. It's not just like, the eating of it wasn't the deal. It was the fellowship together at the tabernacle. So Robert, if you tuned in earlier, yeah, I thought it was in chapter 3. Like I know the facts, and then I'm reading chapter 3. It's like, oh, it doesn't say it there. So it must be somewhere in Numbers, I'm assuming. So I'll post it in the links or whatnot at the end. God bless you guys. Have a great day. Fellowship with your church. Plan on eating the food. Plan on that fellowship. That's part of church that isn't part of too many churches. And that fellowship time is so key in your growth, in your accountability, in the prayerfulness and the unity in the body of Christ. So eat with your church members. Remember, and you're not a church unless you're out and gathering as a church. God bless you.